Suddenly, in just over a month, we've shot up from 2,000 subscribers to over 20,000 subscribers, and a lot of that was thanks to a particularly cheap PC build. So we thought we'd try that again, only this time making the budget even smaller, with the 25p PC build. So starting off with the motherboard, we have an Asus PR4800 VM, which is for the socket 478, and it's from 2002. It was nothing fancy upon its release, but for budget gamers of the time, it was very interesting with what it offered, but we'll get onto that later on. It doesn't have any SATA ports, but does have two IDE connectors along with an AGP 8 time slot and a host of compatible CPUs, which I got from the boot fair along with a load of other bits for a cost of 20p. But as I said, the motherboard wasn't exactly on its own, and it came with an Intel stock cooler and a rather destroyed Pentium 4 along with 2GB of DDR4 100MHz RAM. A fairly nice amount for this build of this price. The hard drive isn't great, but then again I found it and don't really want to know what's on it and haven't decided to look. It's a Fujitsu OEM hard drive from 1999 and can store a whole 16GB of data. It's also from a time before hard drives were silent, so you can hear it click up, and click a lot because it likes to click for some random reason, but at least it does turn on. And then we needed something to power all this, and what's better than a Q-Tech 400-watt power supply unit, which is scratched, rusted and dented and also sounds like an air turbine, and also is apparently unworking and not safe due to the fact there's a screw loose in it. And I don't mean it's loose as in it's just there but still held in place, I mean there's a piece of metal rattling around in our power supply. Oh, and the seller was happy to part with it for 5p because I'd already cleared out most of the PC parts he had and he had no idea what he was actually selling. But what about the graphics card? I didn't actually mention one. Well, the IXP 200 was really one of the reasons this build was so cheap, as the IXP 200 is actually integrated onto this motherboard, but we'll get back to that later on in the video. And finally, the part I'm not sure many of you actually care about, which is the case. An old shoebox which is from when I used to work at McDonald's. So yeah, that was free. So let's move on to the build. We're going to be modifying the box, because otherwise nothing will actually fit in the box. So using the motherboard to measure out the length we needed, we began to cut away from the side. So I guess you could say that we're preparing it. Not only that, but once we'd done that, we needed to get an I/O shield in place. Because for once the seller of the board hadn't lost it. I don't know why, but whenever I buy this cheap crap, they always seem to work fine and have all the pieces to them. And when I buy expensive stuff, they end up not working, or are missing parts, etc, etc. So, prying away at the box, we now have a sort of basic case thing, or at least a box with some holes in it. So as you guys know, to put an I/O shield in your PC, they usually just clip into place. Well, unfortunately, we're a tad above that standard over here, so we're going to use some electrical tape, just to give it that premium won't fall out of place kind of feel. So the case is done, and at least looks somewhat ready to use. So let's move on to the motherboard, which just involved putting our Pentium 4 in place, then the thermal paste, before moving on to the cooler, which is also broken, but I didn't notice that when I picked it up. Not that it would matter at this price whether or not it was broken, because to be honest, when you're spending 20p on a bundle, I'm pretty sure you're allowed to have some broken parts in there. So it just pushed down on one side and should be enough to keep contact and actually keep our net burst wonder working, or at least stop the case catching on fire, which I wouldn't be surprised. This is a Pentium 4 we're talking about. Then for the RAM, we tried to match them up so they'd work in dual channel, but as they're all rated at the same frequency, they should be okay there. Then, after adding yet more holes to our already destroyed box case thing, it was time to move on to the power supply unit. And by fix, I mean by opening up real quick and removing the screw that was in there, because when you're dealing with high voltages, it's best not to have a lump of metal rolling inside your unit. Not that I usually recommend opening up your power supply unit anyway, unless you completely got rid of all the charge in it. So within seconds of opening up, we got the screw out of it and were ready to put it in our PC. So with preparations done and not much else left to say about it, let's get on with putting this whole thing together. And there it is, probably the cheapest PC I've ever done. But is it actually any good? And more importantly, does it actually work without killing us? Let's find out. So while I plug all this in, let's talk a little bit more about what's actually inside this PC. Now, if you remember from earlier, I said that we didn't need to worry about a graphics card. Well, that's exactly it. This chipset was highly sought after in the early 2000s due to the integrated graphics being able to rival the ATI Radeon 9200, matching it in a lot of gaming scenarios thanks to the power of the Pentium 4 that it was commonly paired with. So as much hate as the actual Pentium 4 usually gets, it was actually pretty sought after due to this chipset. So one thing I noticed after turning it on for the first time was that the display output seemed to be messed up all over the place. So I did the normal thing of reseating the RAM and then everything went back to working as normal, because you can't forget, the integrated graphics uses the system RAM as its VRAM, which is one of the main limiting factors in terms of performance. I decided to set up Windows XP on this as there's no better OS for hardware like this, and after tracking down a few of the drivers the PC was ready to go. But of course it's not like the PC doesn't have its faults. Namely, the hard drive was a little bit slow compared to some of the newer IDE models such as the one from the £1 PC build. Still not much of an issue, and I'm really nitpicking at this point, as booting and programs were relatively quick to open. Finding programs was also very easy. I mean, it's Windows XP, so software is definitely not an issue just yet. Many new releases still support it, along with programs such as Steam actually ready to work on this computer, still receiving updates to this day. I did transfer some files across from my laptop because we have USB ports, so why not take advantage of them? Just a couple of zip files with larger programs so I wouldn't have to re-download them. So with it all transferred across, let's see what it performs like in some benchmarks. Up first we have the incredibly exciting extracting files, which was, well, good. I mean, I can't genuinely find any flaws with this kind of performance and this price. It took a little while to extract some of the smaller files, but all in all it worked fine. General web browsing was definitely possible on the PC, even while multitasking. I was able to visit some forums, solve a few issues on the PC, and generally set it up solely from the internet completely fine. I mean, I was running Amazon, Reddit, etc. It's not a bad experience and I can't fault it for 25p. But you guys didn't come here to find out if you can unzip files. So we're going to actually go on to some gaming benchmarks. With Counter-Strike Source up first in the 576p resolution with DirectX 8.1 mode enabled and the low setting selected. We saw averages of 42 FPS and minimums down to 31 FPS, so it was definitely playable, especially for the 25p purchase price. Moving on to GTA Vice City, which ran flawlessly with medium settings in the 480p resolution. It had a nice 48 FPS average with lows down to 23 FPS when we were in heavy gunfights, which happens even on the consoles of the time. In fact, it actually ran better than the consoles and looked better, so for 25p I'm not complaining. And as for something less than a decade old, we have Mountain Blade Warband from 2010 running with a mix of low and medium settings in the 576p resolution, and for the most part it ran at 32 FPS, but in the heaviest bits of battle it could hit lows down to 15 FPS. However, this wasn't very often, you can always cut down the battle size to solve this issue. Command & Conquer Generals ran with medium settings in the 800x600 resolution and was completely fine for a strategy game, at a 35 FPS average with minimums down to 19 FPS when there are a lot of units on screen. And I mean a lot of units, we're talking like the entire screen was filled with them when we got to this stage. So for the most part the game was very fluid and definitely playable, at least more so than when I grew up playing it. Morrowind was definitely on par with the Xbox version of the game, running with 24 FPS and dropping down to 15 FPS in towns and cities, all while in the 640x480 resolution in the lowest settings selected. So pretty much exactly like the original Xbox version. With some mods or tweaking you could definitely make things a tad better though. As for Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, it ran alright and was tested to keep Kakoka happy, so please do enjoy this small section of benchmarking Kakoka. And then finally we have Fable the Lost Chapters, which ran about the same as the original Xbox version of the game, with averages of 29 FPS and minimums down to 12 FPS. However, do keep in mind this was in the 480p resolution with low settings selected, so it didn't look as good as the Xbox port did. As for recording, I couldn't be asked to set up DxTory this time, so I just used Fraps. So recording in half resolution while playing CS 1.6, and well, it didn't look amazing, but it sure was definitely playable in game, and you could see what I was doing relatively well. So for a 25p PC, yes, you can record some basic gameplay. But not only can you edit all the footage you want, you can edit it using Serif Movie Plus X6, which is an amazing lightweight editor that is based on Sony Vegas 11, so we could happily edit away at all the 1080p content I'd recorded, and even make some proxy files to make playback a bit smoother. But do keep in mind, once you've added a lot of effects, that playback in real time could be a tad difficult. And once again, it all comes down to my conclusion. And we're here again, and am I going to recommend you build this PC? Well, if you can get it in this price range, sure, but that's not the point of this video. I mean, the PC probably isn't safe, sounds like a jet engine, and it looks somewhat cool in that box, but the main reason for this video isn't to show you the performance I can get for 25p, it's a thank you and a tribute to all of the support I've had so far on the channel, thanks to you guys making all this possible. Without your support watching these videos and the folks over on Patreon to help fund the channel, none of this would be possible. So here's to another 6 months making videos, and thank you to all 20,000 of you. Good night. So I'm sorry for the delay on this one, as it took a little while to get all the parts and then build it. And recently I've been a tad ill, which you may have noticed from the voiceover. Still, thank you very much for watching, and do like and subscribe for more content just like this.